The people who are already turned on got more turned on. There are a few people who are getting turned on who got more turned on. But the problem is the media sent a message, the narrative, right? The narrative in the media globally was the message that you're a victim of a virus. And that is largely known as germ theory. The message wasn't, if you have chronic inflammation, here's what you can do to lower your inflammation so that when you do get the virus, and when you get one of the mutations of the virus, that it won't be that big a deal. And it'll make your system stronger because you'll naturally build antibodies. In fact, a lot of that science was suppressed. It's since come out, but it was suppressed.
Podcast Junkies, episode 297. Welcome back. I'm your host, Harry Duran. Newcomers to the show, welcome, welcome, welcome. It's the one where we seek out interesting voices in podcasting and get them to kick back their heels and talk about their shows and whatever else is on their mind. Given the state of the world today, there's always a topic we're going to be finding interesting on this show, and I appreciate them sharing their time and their stories. Last week, in case you missed it, we spoke to Donna Laughlin, who joined the show to talk about the insatiable need for human-to-human connection, manifesting what you want in life, and her desire to tell stories that aren't being told through her podcast before it happened. We discussed a wide variety of topics, ranging from her experiences flying planes and driving race cars to her journalism career, to the fascinating conversations she's been able to have with her guests on the show. So make sure you check that out in case you missed it. I'm grateful for the opportunity to partner with Focusrite. I'm so excited to talk about their newest line of sound cards, the Vocaster. It's got an endless list of features. I'll go through a couple here. Auto gain, easily set your levels with the click of a button. With more than enough gain on tap, 70 dB, no booster needed. An enhanced feature which allows 4 podcaster-approved voice presets, which will bring out the best in any voice. You can silence the mic with the touch of a mute button and record phone calls, high-quality music, or any audio from your device seamlessly. You can record to a camera directly to its memory card. It's got a loopback feature to stream calls or any other audio you can think of from your computer, and 3 amazing packages of software, Hindenburg Lite, 3 months of Squadcast Pro plus video, and 6 months of Acast Influencer. What an amazing package. You can learn more at podcastjunkies.com/Vocaster. This week, I spoke to Cate Stillman, the founder and CEO of YogaHealer and Yoga Health Coaching. She joins the show to discuss her work as an innovative Ayurvedic practitioner, yoga teacher, and health coach. She's the author of 4 books, including Body Thrive and Master of You. And in this episode, we engage in a rich conversation about digital marketing, positive stressor habits, and what it means to be living on purpose. All things that are really fascinating to me, and I love deep diving on these topics. She talks about her work guiding people to live their unique, greater purpose and how she's grown as a podcaster. And one of her more exciting focuses currently, which is, above all things, urine therapy. Stay tuned for that one. As always, full show notes available at podcastjunkies.com/297. And if you are enjoying this episode or past episodes, as always, I'd love it if you leave a rating or review at ratethispodcast.com/podcastjunkies. Also, I think it's important to you as a podcaster to communicate to your audience, as I'm doing right now, that over the years, I've found that the best way to discover podcasts is when they're recommended to me. And so in that spirit, if you are enjoying the show, if you just found the show, if you're a long-time listener, every once in a while, I'm going to ask you to find one person that you think would be entertained, educated, and inspired by this content, and share with them. Say, hey, have you heard about Podcast Junkies with Harry Duran? It's the one with the yellow background. You can't miss it. Going on 8+ years. So that's my ask to you this week, to share the podcast with one person. If you're feeling adventurous, don't forget to try out one of the new podcast apps at newpodcastapps.com that support direct contributions to the podcast host. One of the favorites that I'm testing out is Fountain, and you can find it at fountain.fm. There was a nice write-up by the folks at Pod News recently, and Oscar Mary, the founder of Fountain, was on Podland with Sam Sethi and James Cridland. So make sure you check out that interview. It's one of the more recent ones. And he talks about his plans for the app and why it's such a valuable addition to the podcast app ecosystem. Make sure you stay to the end of the episode where I reveal this week's recension hashtag. But for now, let's get into this conversation with Cate Stillman. So Cate Stillman, host of YogaHealer podcast. Thank you for joining me on Podcast Junkies.
Thanks, Harry. I'm excited to be here.
So we were just chatting in the green room, so to speak, about all the connections we have and the mutual friends we have. And you mentioned your friendship with the founder of Sushi Podcast, friends of this podcast, Elsie Escobar and Jessica Kupferman. And your connection with Elsie goes back to 2003. Is that right?
Yeah, we were teachers in Anusara yoga, and at one training, we put our mats down next to each other. We had so much fun. Later, she found out I was putting all these audio files in my blog, all these audio interviews, and she's like, Cate, that's a podcast. Oh, so that was maybe around 2009, I think.
Okay. Yeah, because I was looking on your website and I noticed them as blog posts, and then I wasn't able to trace back to when you actually took the audio and I guess launched it with a proper podcast host. And so would that would have been 2009?
Yeah, I think by 2010 was when I got it going. Yeah, when we switched over the files into, she kind of walked me through the process, and I was like, just to some degree, like not wanting to bother. I was just wanting to interview great people, and that's really where it was coming from. Is I had an online course I started in 2007 called the Living Ayurveda course. And at that time it was $1,000. Now it's $7,500. But same idea, where we hold people through their own healing journey. And so as part of that, I think this is one of the things that a lot of podcasters realize who've been in it for a while. It's like, oh my gosh, I have a platform in which I can have really cool conversations that I couldn't have if I didn't have the platform. So because I had the course and the course members and they were asking these questions, I was able to interview some really phenomenal gurus and yogis that were very established in their just high level training, and they would come and talk to us for an hour for free. And I was like, this is the best gig going. And then the students wanted to share it with their sister or their best friend or their yoga teacher. And so I put it in my blog, because I had a blog. I'd been blogging for years. And that's sort of what eventually led me to podcast.
What's interesting is that you were early on in podcasting, even if you weren't calling it podcasting. But I'm curious just to kind of see how far this goes, because you were, even the courses, the fact that you were early on with your course, which has now grown to what it is today. So can you pinpoint like when your digital marketing journey began? Was it with the blog?
It actually started long before the blog. I mean, if we trace, content marketing, right? Like I was always a content marketer. it was kind of funny, but like I was analog, and then I started YogaHealer.com in 2001. I was living in San Francisco at the time, and I posted on Craigslist, which started in San Francisco, which was actually really big in 2001 in San Francisco. And I posted like, hey, I need someone to help me design a website, and I'll trade you if you're in back pain. I'll get you out of back pain. And I got 20 responses in 24 hours. Because it was the .com bust. It was San Francisco. There were web developers everywhere. They all had back pain because of sitting on their butts all day.
That's so funny.
It was so funny. So I got this guy. He came over to my apartment, and we started on Dreamweaver. And I just started to basically share. I was going back and forth between an Ayurvedic medicine community, that's the healing science of yoga, and a very serious yoga teacher training community in San Francisco. I was in both those schools, and some of my teachers were involved with both of those schools. There's some overlap. But I found that the communities really didn't, they had so much to share with each other and really had a hard time communicating. And so that was really the beginning of my content marketing and course curriculum journey, where I would just create really usable, shareable, pieces of information, tip sheets, like that kind of thing, print them out and bring them, to the appropriate community so they could understand each other. And I started my email list then with, old school technology. I think I started with Constant Contact.
Wow.
Back in the day, and just knew that it was a dialogue, like that they would ask me the best questions, and then I would answer them in email. And I would post information on my website, and I don't know if you remember Dreamweaver, but it was like all these like blocks.
No, I was just gonna tell you that I learned Dreamweaver. I know Dreamweaver not well, but I at the time I sort of jumped into it because I remember friends were using Front Page, and I hated Front Page, and I'm more kind of visual, so I remember using PageMaker because this is going back now to, I think the company's called Aldous. I'm like now going back in my mental archives here, but I did some newsletter stuff with PageMaker, and I think Dreamweaver was part of the same family. And I loved the sort of kind of what they call the WYSIWYG, what you see is what you get aspect of it. And I remember creating like hover over graphics. You would hover over your mouse and it would change like a different color. And it took me like a while to figure out how to do that in Dreamweaver. And I thought that was the coolest thing in the world. But yeah, I mean, my early websites were also built in Dreamweaver.
Yeah, and that was that was really the beginning. And people would just ask me questions and I would create workshops and handouts. And then that was the beginning of content marketing. And so with putting them on the internet wasn't a big step.
And so if you were building your email list from way back when, assuming you've kept it up, it must be a pretty decent sized list by now.
We buy traffic now, but it grew organically in a potent way. But now we buy traffic off Facebook, and we're about 70,000, so not huge, like nothing ridiculous.
That's great. That's good.
But just a healthy list that really supports the people that are on it with good content.
So talk a little bit about your yoga journey, because that's obviously the source of the content. And I'm wondering like how that got started.
Yeah, well, I think I was doing yoga before I knew what yoga was. Very much there's different types of yoga too. Like there's the, hatha yoga, which is the body yoga that we associate with yoga today. But there's also jnana yoga and bhakti yoga. And I'm more of a jnana yogi, like a wisdom yogi. So very much an intellectual yogi. So I went into yoga leaving climate change politics and policy. So I was, basically a save the planet. I studied international environmental law and politics in undergrad and finished school in China and went to work on policy in Washington, D.C. and quickly became disillusioned in pollution issues and realized that I could sacrifice my life and wouldn't be able to counter big business. And that was depressing, but luckily I was young enough. And so I decided to work at the human consciousness angle instead of the policy angle. Like how do we help humans evolve? Because when people elevate consciousness, they stop doing certain behaviors. And they become a lot more pollution conscious. And
they stop destroying the planet.
They stop destroying the planet, exactly. And they start to realize it's it's one people, one planet. And so I decided to devote my life to that instead. So I did a big pivot and moved away from DC, moved to the mountains. I was able to telecommute in 1996. I know, it's kind of wild. I'm a bit of a futurist. So, and then that really brought me into
ahead of the curve.
Deep investigation of what wisdom tradition really understands human consciousness and how to shift human consciousness. And because I had been in China and knew quite a bit of Chinese language at the time, I've since forgotten it. But I was debating between Ayurvedic medicine and Chinese medicine. But I found that Ayurveda, which its language base is Sanskrit, that it was much more it was much more accessible to a Western mind than Chinese, both philosophically but also linguistically. And so that brought me deeper into yoga and Ayurveda, the healing science behind yoga. And that's more or less where I've been. And since then, I've evolved more into a more of all indigenous cultures and traditional medicines type of perspective. But my base is still much more strong in Ayurveda and yoga, philosophically speaking.
So for folks that are new to this space, because even though you were ahead of the curve back then, and this was something that you were learning for the first time and going deep into it, there's still people now that have no idea what that's about. So maybe just a quick primer on how you would describe how learning this Ayurvedic medicine, the yoga teachings, how that began to transform your life personally, and what, if anything, effect it had in how you dealt with the day-to-day realities of the world we live in.
Yeah. There's so many ways to answer this question. I mean, to me, one of the two core things I want to talk about is there's a lot of us don't even who aren't raised religiously, don't even realize we're raised in Judeo-Christian culture that has certain assumptions built into it that are really quite different than the assumptions in Taoism or Zen or yoga. And so one of the first things was you are the creator. You and the creator are one, right? That's Eastern philosophy. Western philosophy was that, or at least the the biblical interpretations are like Christ is the son of the Father, but you're not him. So you're essentially different than the divine. So in the East, it's like, that responsibility's on you. Like, you're the divine. You're in the seat of the creator. What are you going to do with it? And because you are the creator, like who you are is intrinsically evolution. So you are the whole and you are separate. And so it's just a very different place to navigate from. It's very empowering, but it's also like, it's the mantle of responsibility. And then secondly, Eastern philosophy and Eastern medicine, and it's very much where Western medicine or Western science or allopathic scientific literature has ended up today, which is basically circadian rhythm trumps everything. So in studying Ayurvedic medicine, the first thing that really landed for me, and these were the first workshops I was teaching in San Francisco in 2001, are Daily Habits of a Yogi, which later became a year-long course that I lead called Body Thrive. And it's based on the 10 I just took circadian rhythm, which is basically like we're diurnal species. We digest better in the middle of the day. We sleep better if we sleep during the darkness. It's just basic habits that align to rhythm, which are totally disrupted right now. And other parts of circadian rhythm are a natural fasting rhythm that we're not meant to just snack all day and eat all the time, but that our physiology needs rest and digest in order to metabolize and reset and go into stages of autophagy that actually allow digesting inflammation. So those were the two big things. It was like, A, you're the creator, B, there's a rhythm, and you don't trump rhythm. No individual can trump rhythm. So if you live against the rhythm, you're going to suffer. If you live with the rhythm, you'll experience power.
Yeah, I think I was raised Catholic, and I think when you don't know any better, because this is what you're taught, if you don't put yourself in an environment where you can begin to question things, and I'm just naturally curious and just was always looking for the source of all things, and I would unravel something and it would take me down another rabbit hole. And now I tell people, like, because of my connection with spirituality, I've done plant medicine. I feel like a direct connection to creator spirit that is very powerful for me, but it's been an ongoing process, and always questioning, always looking for new answers, and not taking what I hear or what I read as the be all end all. I think the way I've described it is I don't want to have anyone get in my way of my connection to God. It's just like me, direct connection, like no other person, no church, no other organized religion gets in the way. And I think to your point, when you recognize that there is some sense of responsibility, because you then have a way in which how the world works, and again, coming back to responsibility of how to behave in this world and what the right choices are, not necessarily that you always make them, but that you're aware that they exist. And for me, it feels like just a lifelong journey here. I literally feel, because of experiences I had in an ayahuasca session, that I basically picked this life experience, and I selected my parents, and I said, I know exactly what I need to work on from my soul's perspective, and it's going to be in this human form, in this incarnation, and that's literally like what I'm tasked with in this life experience for myself.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, I mean, the entheogens, like the plant medicines that bust through the veils of consciousness, or what the yogis call Maya, and give us a real tangible first-person experience of like, I and the creator are one.
Yeah. I'm wondering how you see people's awakening journey unfold when they're first made aware of these teachings, when they first start to do the practices. Given that you've been doing it for so long, and through the teacher training you've had, I'm guessing you would see certain patterns or consistencies in terms of how people are awakened to this and the experiences they have. And I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to that, to give people a flavor for, folks who may not be aware of what is possible if you decide to go down this path.
Yeah, well, and now, I mean, my path has shifted so much from teaching yoga, where I was 20-some years ago, to really leading people through habit changes. And it's really what we do is the daily circadian rhythm habits. And the biggest awakening that people have is how much symptomology is optional, how much they've been accelerating their own aging process, how much they've been actually creating the symptoms that they're experiencing, creating the diseases that are in their body. And there's a bit of and usually there's some anger that comes out. with that, like anger against culture, anger against society, anger against the corporations that are largely, unregulated and disrupting human genetics and our in our ecosystems as well. So that's a lot. It's a lot for someone to, it's like you go from being like a victim, like I feel like a victim of this, to now I'm in the seat of the creator and I'm empowered, but like kind of pissed, like why is all this crap? I mean, I was in one of those big box stores the other day that sells big boxes of stuff, and this obese woman was putting in a huge box of like candy in her cart, and it's like, when there's some degree that we want to blame the consumer, but I think what happens on the path often is we actually also want to blame our policies and our institutions and the companies that are allowed to create highly addictive substances and food factories that disrupt human genetics.
Yeah.
I don't know. Does that answer the question? I mean, to me, it is like a big part of the battle of the awakening process. Is like, oh, wow, the odds are kind of tipped against me acting in my own best interest.
It's interesting, that aspect. Yeah, I understand that experience you have when you go into a big box store like that. And there is a sense of, I think part of it is people, it's almost that, I always come back to that scene in The Matrix when there's that one guy who sort of like is the double agent, and he's cutting the steak and he's drinking the wine, and he's like, I know it's not real. He's like, but you know what? Like, I don't care. Like, it's just, I know that the Matrix exists, but like, this tastes good, and I'm going to just savor this and just maybe put blinders on and realize like, I'm just going to live in my world of like immediate gratification. And I myself, like, sometimes fall into that, not to that degree, but I'm wondering, it's scary. Change is scary for folks, especially if you don't have a support group. And I'm wondering, people not only see that they need to take the first step, but then like are probably looking around and saying like, am I going to be doing this alone? Who am I doing this for? What's the bigger purpose? And, we only have so much life on this planet. So should I just go for it and just, have the foot on the gas the whole way through and just say I lived life vicariously and I lived it to the extreme? And the other side of that could be, I've lived it more consciously and maybe seeing the bigger picture, because if you feel like you are an eternal soul, then maybe that'll color your decisions differently. But it's not easy, especially when you have, I just immediately think of family members because I want them all to be on the path, and it's not for everyone, and it comes at a time and a place when they're ready to hear the message. And I imagine when people get to start working with you, they've already made the conscious decision that a change needs to happen. They may not be fully grasping or understanding what the next step is, and I think that's maybe where you help them. But I'm wondering where your thoughts are on people who just say, life is tough and you just got to make the best of it what you can.
Yeah. Well, the problem with it's not really, if we actually look at the habits of modern culture, or what I call conventional culture, is the habits of conventional culture lead to chronic inflammation, which leads to chronic disease, which is the number one killer worldwide. So the World Health Organization's new stats are that 3 out of 5 people today, and it's actually a little bit more than that recently, but like their more recent report is 3 out of 5 people die of chronic disease. Now, about 100 years ago, chronic disease didn't really exist. It was like 5% of the population. Right now, not just people dying of chronic disease, but people that have symptoms of chronic inflammation. And chronic means they don't go away. Chronic usually means if you go to a doctor, you're going to be put on medication for chronic. So right now in the United States, 30% of children are on chronic inflammation medications. And that's lifestyle and diet driven. It's not something the medication can actually solve for. So it's not like you feel awesome and you're enjoying how you feel every day, pedal to the metal. Like you feel like shit, and you increasingly feel like shit, and you stack meds and you stack diseases, because then you also have comorbidities. So anyone that was like afraid of COVID, right? It was a virus. If you had low allostatic load, so if you had low inflammation, usually you had a lot less fear in general, because you knew your immune system was strong and that you could handle viruses and fight viruses, even the big scary ones. The more allostatic load you have, which is the more oxidative stress or the more inflammation there is chronically or systemically in your physiology, the more you did have to worry about. Because you already were carrying a load that would make an infection more severe and could kill you, right? And so what we see is like 100 years ago, acute inflammation would kill you, not chronic. And modern medicine's done a lot to help us with, fight bacterial infections on an acute level. But diet and lifestyle over the last 100 years, and if you look at it's just straight hockey stick growth curves and chronic inflammation, chronic disease, sugar consumption, and vegetable oil consumption. And all of those things, it's like if that's what like living on the, living by the seat of your pants is really all about. The problem is you wake up every morning and you feel groggy and heavy, and you feel like you have cravings, and you're not really in control of what you want to eat because your cravings are dictating what you're doing and how you're thinking, and you're losing focus. The studies are very, very well established that as soon as you have less resistance to insulin, you basically have lower cognitive function. So you're no longer able to focus. And over time, that really degenerates your neuroplasticity, so you can't learn. It's harder to learn. And over time, your world gets smaller and smaller. So the other direction, the more conscious direction, which might seem more restrictive at first, opens to much greater freedom. And that essentially is the path of yoga. Path of yoga is the path of complete freedom, freedom of the creator, where you get to design your next reality. And it leads to deep focus, and it leads to deep sleep, and it leads to a very deep level of metabolism where you just aren't in consumer mindset anymore. You're in citizen or creator mindset, and you're able to take much greater risks in your life than if you have chronic inflammation. If you have chronic inflammation, your world gets increasingly small. And so do what you want to do, because your zone of safety becomes smaller and smaller. The world becomes more and more like viruses, right? Things become much more threatening than if you have a rock solid, resilient immune system, as you are designed to do by your human biology. So the second point is, yes, your habits are not your own. So if you want to change your habits, anyone listening is like, I got to change my habits. Like, I need to get on the bandwagon, right? Like, you can't do it on your own. Like, you need to find a community of people that already has those habits if you want to root yourself in success and make it easier and more fun. And the other thing, the third thing, and then I'll shut up, is that it's not, change isn't linear, it's cyclical, it's rhythmic, it's spirals. So you will have ups and downs along the way. And that's where community can also really help. Because when you're at a low point, it always feels like you're just at back at the beginning, but you're not. You're not. You've automated some habits, you've made some progress, and the community can help bolster you right back to your edge of evolution.
What have you seen after COVID? Is there anything in terms of awareness, more interest in people looking for alternatives, looking to strengthen their own immune system, that just, it was something that wasn't top of mind for them pre-COVID, but, because of the realities of what we've gone through. I myself lost my best friend from high school to COVID. He was, we had fallen out of touch, but I found out like a little overweight and put on the ventilator, and, I assumed he would come through, but he didn't. And that was a big shock when you have someone that's in your age group and someone that's that close to you. But it just, I think, was not necessarily a wake-up call, because I've always been into alternative health, and I don't know if you know Gary Null. He's like an old school health pioneer that was one of my early podcasts, but just always into like new ways of thinking in terms of alternative health. But it just was a reminder for me that's something that's important, and something that you also need to do a little bit of research in, because no one's going to come to you and say, hey, this is how you live an optimal life. And I imagine that sort of same shock happened to a lot of people. And I'm wondering if it's something you saw from your perspective, both going into this and even coming out of it now.
Yes and no. So, the people who are already turned on got more turned on. There are a few people who are getting turned on who got more turned on. But the problem is the media sent a message, the narrative, right? The narrative in the media globally was the message that you're a victim of a virus. And that is largely known as germ theory. The message wasn't, if you have chronic inflammation, here's what you can do to lower your inflammation so that when you do get the virus, and when you get one of the mutations of the virus, that it won't be that big a deal. And it'll make your system stronger because you'll naturally build antibodies. In fact, a lot of that science was suppressed. It's since come out, but it was suppressed. And so unfortunately, what we actually saw is a rise in sugar consumption, a rise in alcohol consumption, a rise in drug consumption. We saw a rise in chronic inflammation and a rise in the comorbidities of the diseases of chronic inflammation, all of which make any kind of virus a lot more dangerous. And again, because chronic inflammation leads to neurodegeneration, meaning your brain degenerates, it's harder to learn new things. And it's easier to get more and more isolated and more in the seat of the victim, where it's too hard to change. No one around me changing. I can't do anything anyway. So, I mean, I don't need to be gloom and doom like at all. But yeah, I mean, what a missed opportunity. I mean, if these corporations really cared about the humans, right? Like, that was a big missed opportunity. And since then, there's some really good podcasts out there. A lot of them get quickly labeled and cancel cultured and whatnot. But in terms of the science, I just wrote a book called Wild Habits, where the first part of the book, I focus entirely on chronic inflammation, and the science is in, and it's not questionable. I mean, it's just study after study after study around chronic inflammation comorbidities and the severity of the virus and the link between habits and depression and habits and neurodegeneration and habits and insulin resistance and on and on and on. So, I mean, the good news is really simple things work and they're all free. Yeah. That's the good news. The bad news is they're hard.
What are some examples of those?
Fasting, intermittent fasting. Intermittent fasting, to me, is the number one habit everybody must have. I have a good interview on YogaHealer with Mark Mattson, who was an NIH. He ran a division of the NIH. He has some of the most aggregate research on intermittent fasting. And he started the interview with human brains used to be 10% bigger 10,000 years ago. So he has an evolutionary perspective of intermittent fasting and neurodegeneration. And he really sees it all firsthand. So it's basically like this. Even pregnant women, even toddlers fast in the old times. And this is just shocking to us now, because most pregnant women are overfed. Over a third of babies are delivered through C-section, which means their microbiomes don't get properly established in the early part of the life, which leads to chronic inflammation by the time they're children, which also explains some of the medication of children. So, fasting builds resilience. Our physiologies are so strong, and if we allow them to be. And one of the easiest ways to disrupt cellular function is overfeeding or feeding too frequently. So even if we're not eating too much, if we're eating too frequently, our physiology doesn't go into autophagy. So the cells don't actually repair at the level of the mitochondria, which are the little energy centers in the cells. Yeah. And so then you have dysfunction replicating dysfunction. And you have the degeneration then of human DNA via epigenetics and DNA methylation. So it's the stakes are really high, the stakes are really high. We are degenerating as a species, to be clear. And the symptomology that we see in children and adults and elders right now is not aging. That's not aging. That's accelerated aging. That's the technical term for it. We're accelerating how we're aging. It's also called inflammaging, where you have accelerated aging due to inflammation. And there's also meta-inflammation, which is this, when you're overfeeding, what happens to cells. And that's really where the majority of the population is right now, even, in poor communities and developed countries, everywhere. And we're spreading that. So countries that are going from starvation quickly go to meta-inflammation. It's kind of a bizarre time with that. So simply fasting, and for fasting, for most people, it's just eat one meal less a day. It's really easy. It's a thing that you don't do. Drink black coffee or black tea or green tea or matcha or anything, because caffeine suppresses appetite. Sip hot water. It's an idea. I sip a lot of hot water. And then you start to play with metabolic flexibility. So some people will eventually just eat one meal a day or a meal a day and a snack. And even starting kids on this is great, where instead of having snacks all day for kids, just having them have 3 meals a day. And then by the time they become teenagers, often some days 2 meals a day. And then some days they're not that hungry, so a meal a day and a snack. And that's just enough to really reset the metabolism and allow the physiology to start to digest some of the waste within the cells. It allows the fat cells to release some of the triglycerides back into the bloodstream to lean out the fat cells. And When fat cells are leaned out, they're actually anti-inflammatory. They send anti-inflammatory signals through the bloodstream. But when we're overfed, our fat cells actually send pro-inflammatory markers into the bloodstream and generate inflammation. So just from the level of overfeeding, inflammation is created from the adipose tissue, from the fat cells. So it's the easiest thing to do. It's just like eat less frequently. Just eat less frequently.
Yeah. My partner and I have tried a little of the keto and then the intermittent fasting. Is 16 hours a good starting window? So eat last meal at 8 and then your first one at noon next day?
Yeah, and some people are in wild habits. I get into body types, which is a big part of Ayurvedic medicine. And most indigenous medicines had body typing where they understood you're a little different than me, So how are we different? And we talk about that in the most simple terms in terms of elements. So people that are high fire have really strong metabolism. These are the kind of people that get really hangry. It might be much harder for that person to wait till noon. So that type of person might be much better off breaking their fast by 10 a.m. and being done eating by 6 p.m. or even doing an 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. as their 16-8. As it's known in the intermittent fasting world. Those that have a lot more density, like people that are, big boned, blockheads, like that kind, like thicker people that are naturally more resilient, that actually have stronger endurance. They do great skipping breakfast and doing that 12-8. Where I help people understand some of that flexibility is, say you're much more of a lighter type, like olive oil in the Popeye movies, like real tall, thin, lanky. Elsie's a great example of a Vata type or Wind type. People like that, they need more regularity. And so 16-8 is a really good normal rhythm for them, even with some 14-10s built in for metabolic flexibility and occasionally 18-6s where they're fasting for 18 hours. Whereas more of the Bruno types, the thicker body types, they do really well with 24s thrown in at least a couple times a week where their eating window's only 4 hours.
Oh, wow. So
body type really does help accentuate your physiology in light of how you're designed. So pittas are in the middle and 16-8s are great. So the fire types are good with that.
Just going to ask if, obviously for folks that are just easing their way into this, picking maybe 1 or 2 days a week to go IF is a good way to start?
I really like people to start with a 1-week challenge. Just map out your eating times for a week, center it around an 8-hour feed time. If you want to play the edge, you might choose, one day to do a 6-hour eating window and then, one day do a 10-hour eating window so you can figure that out. But put those times on your calendar for a whole week so that you can notice. Because often just doing it now and then you won't be able to notice as much, but in a week, you'll be able to get a really strong sense of this is how I feel. This is what I look like in the morning. This is how I feel in the morning. This is what's happening with my focus. A lot of people notice a change in their ability to do deep work. And to me, that's important. People get a sense of what their habits are creating.
And naturally, I think with my overthinking brain, I'm naturally want to know all the specifics of what to eat and what kind of food to eat and does coffee break the fast, and just probably just going too far. The challenge with me sometimes is go too far down the rabbit holes, and I want the specific actual recipe, tell me what to eat, what to drink, when to eat it outlined for me.
Well, okay, so what breaks the fast is calories. And so, but there's actually, and just to the danger that you're speaking of, there's a bunch of exceptions to the rules. But in general, not having calories, but also from the Ayurvedic or holistic perspective, not having non-caloric sweeteners is also much better. So not having stevia even, or some of the chemical sweeteners, because that will actually shift the physiology. So for those who are hardcore, but again, get into it however you get into it, get in through any access point. But then once you're in, those are some things that start to naturally fall away. It's wanting to do more of a clean fast, mostly water, maybe a little bit of black coffee or black tea or green tea, but no milk, no sugar, nothing that'll actually break the fast. What's so cool about fasting is the longer you fast, so say you do a 20-hour fasting window, you're not going to eat junk. You really, junk falls away because your body's where is the nutrition? right? Like, where's the nutrition? And so what we find overall is like, don't focus on what you're eating, focus on when you're eating, play the edge on when you're eating. And what'll happen is what you're eating will fall into sync. Now, I start with my people with like fabulous fats. Like, fat really matters, getting really good high quality fat. And whether that's animal fat or whether that's avocados or raw sesame seeds, like it's really fantastic because it's lubricating. You get a lot of calories. It flushes your gallbladder. Like, there's just a lot of benefit. And it just teaches you that real deep satiation. But in general, I think a lot of people do naturally orient towards phytonutrient-rich diets or keto, which is also phytonutrient-rich plus animals. Phyto means plant, so plant nutrients. And it's kind of as simple as that, like eat seasonally, eat locally, and really enjoy the feasting part, because that's what makes fasting like way easier. And then you stop wanting to graze. Like, grazing starts to fall away. And it might take people, I just wanted to give people too, like, a timeline. Say you're 35 years old and you automate this habit by the time you're 40 years old, right? So it's gone. By the time you're 40, you have a fasting rhythm. You're no longer grazing. You eat real meals. You have metabolic flexibility. You have deep cellular resistance. You're able to focus for hours on end. You're sleeping way deeper. Who cares that it took 5 years? Because your 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, like, now you're anti-aging. So yeah, you're going to have a million ups and downs between age 35 and 40. We have people start at age 70, and we find the older people are often, the easier it is for them to change because they just feel such like shit if they don't do it. They're often faster to change than younger people who have a lot more leeway because usually of activity levels more than, to some degree metabolism, but to a huge degree activity levels. So it doesn't matter when you start, but expect some up and downs and don't judge yourself for it. Just keep doing it. Just keep being like, okay, I'm going to fast a little longer today. And it's a habit that I love. Dr. Jason Fung's comment. He's written a bunch of fasting books and it's all over YouTube. And he's just like, this is something you don't do. It's not something to do. It's not a habit to do. And what my members find in Body Thrive is like their grocery bill goes down usually at 30%. Their restaurant bill goes down 30%. The ROI is huge. And to me, more importantly, just from the carbon footprint standpoint, is like right now in the United States, 40% of food is wasted. Food waste goes to almost nothing. It's so dramatic. Like, that shift is driven by consumer culture. And eating too frequently is just driving food waste.
Yeah, and it's a function, as I think about what's in my cupboard right now, like buying stuff that normally you would have for grazing, making sure that stuff is not in your cupboard, because that's the first place you'll turn to when you get that craving.
Yeah, and it just falls away. That's really what we find is like, it's less of trying to do something or not do something. And it's more that it just falls away.
So you mentioned intermittent fasting as the first change you'd recommend. What would be one other, given the time we have, which is a suggestion for, a movement people can make in the direction of just living a better life?
So going to bed early, waking up early, and walking, regardless of the weather. Like, I'll walk in like 5-degree weather, it's snowing and it's blowing sideways. And part of it is like these habits. And it's part of why this next book is called Wild Habits, because these habits that rewild us are the ones that really turn on our physiology and they turn on our neuroplasticity. And they're called positive stressor habits. So many of you know the difference between distress and eustress. So not all stress is the same. So some stress is where you do the hard thing, and that hard thing makes you smarter and more able to do hard things in your life, which really changes the outlook of your future. It really changes your ability to rise to challenges that otherwise will remain out of your reach. And it makes you truly a hero in your own life. Like, Odysseus had to go on the Odyssey to become Odysseus, right? Like, and that's positive stressors in a nutshell. It's like, you've got to do the hard thing. So when we stay up too late, we're doing email, we're working our 14-hour workday or whatever, as an entrepreneur, as I'm sure a lot of your listeners are, we don't realize that we're basically stealing our potential from tomorrow. We're stealing our deeper thinking, our cognitive function. We're stealing our ability to make good decisions, in terms of diet, lifestyle, in terms of the people we hang out with, in terms of like what we watch with our eyeballs. And so those are called negative stressors. And distress over time is chronic inflammation and leads to chronic disease. So you're just disabling your future potential. We find that habit's hard to change. As a community, it's much easier. Like where we are, it's super rad in Body Thrive to have these totally dorky habits of like going to bed early, waking up early, doing the hard thing first. doing, always exercising on an empty stomach first thing in the morning so that you accentuate autophagy, you make your cells much more vibrant and open to learning for the day. And then hydration is huge. So sipping hot water in particular for anyone that has any of the symptoms of inflammation. So like any skin issues, any digestive issues, like any issues that are just sticking around, mucus, like it's just inflammation's everywhere, is sipping hot water because it just enables the cells to more deeply hydrate and more easily dump what they don't want.
Yeah, it's interesting because my partner and I doing Sober April, because we typically after in the evening, like a glass of wine, but she's conscious of trying to make sure at least twice a year she's taking a full month off. And obviously, since we're in the same house, makes sense that we both do the same thing. And I think something that I've noticed is just like patches of dry skin that may be a symptom of detoxing as well, which is something most people don't think, but also a sign that probably not drinking enough water. So I recently had to upgrade I left my hydro flask at the airport. So I was like, I got to get a new one. But then I saw that they had a 40-ounce one. I was like, well, 3 of these is 120 ounces. So that's my goal, to drink like 3 of these a day.
Yeah. Awesome. And then, as far as other habits, I find silence is really key right now. So often, and I see this as a parent, how much phones have changed childhood, but also adulthood. We're just not allowing our faculties to rest. So from an Ayurvedic perspective, like what you take in through your senses has to be digested, and to be digested needs time and space. So if we don't have that, we just have basically like a buildup of mental impressions over time, which also drives emotional inflammation. And so people can have inflammation outside of diet entirely. That's just linked to too much time taking stuff in through your eyes and ears. Yeah.
And the fatigue as well that sets in. I normally have these blue light blocking glasses, like, when I'm working during the day, and then like the more extreme, like orange ones here. These are like the Dave Asprey level.
Yeah.
But yeah, I remember when I first started using them, I did not explain it, but I really felt like my eyes were like getting some rest.
Yeah. Not so pulled to the surface. Yeah.
Yeah. So so interesting with these conversations, because by the nature of what your topic is, I never know what kind of rabbit hole we're going to go down. And we focus a lot on self-care. We're talking about connection to like a higher power. We're talking about health benefits of intermittent fasting. I want to pull it all together. And it's been a long journey for you as a podcast host. Before you even realized you had a podcast, I'm wondering how you've grown as the host of a show, and anything that you've had that would be like takeaways or lessons learned or some highlights from that journey of hosting the show for this many years.
Yeah, so I think I had the show for different reasons at different times, and for me, the need to be really in touch with why I have the show in a particular time. I feel like I'm probably not a strategic podcaster. Like when I go to the podcast conference, and there's a lot of strategy on how to have a show, and like what to do and how to have the breakdown and this and that. And I find like and then there was a period of time where I was like totally into it. And and I'll probably go back to it, at some point, be like, no, I should actually be strategic about podcasting. Right now I'm using the show as a vehicle to it's kind of right back where I started, to like have conversations that are otherwise not accessible to me. So I'm interviewing scientists now, mostly, as I understand more about biochemistry. I'm trying to understand what they know, because a lot of times that doesn't actually make it into medicine. It just stays in science. It gets published in some studies that you never really make it. They make it somewhere in the scientific community, but on the holistic side, they often don't really make it into the earballs of people where it could be super helpful. So that's like one of the worst podcast strategies, because scientists are not influencers. Like they don't have lists. They don't have social media channels. Like it's like the worst possible strategy. But I think, for me, I am a thought leader. I'm super curious, and I have reason for doing what I'm doing. I have a mission. And so my guess is that's probably why my podcast hasn't died out after a decade, because like I'm willing to find the people I'm most interested in talking to and make sure that conversation happens. Like, I just had a phenomenal conversation with Peter Block on community, and this guy was like, I mean, he and I could have talked for weeks. And he's written 10 books. He's in his 70s, just as amazing. And there's no way I would have had that conversation with Peter Block if I didn't have a podcast, and if he didn't land on my website and be like, she's hundreds and hundreds of episodes, like, like she's not a fly by night, episode 15, and so I don't really know where the podcast is, and I don't know how to give anyone advice in terms of podcasting because people have so many different reasons for doing it.
I think the one thing that you've demonstrated by your actions is the importance of being consistent, but also not being so beholden to download numbers and being more interested in curating content or people who are doing interesting things in the space that you're currently interested in. And probably were it not for your episode, would have a limited platform on which to share what you're seeing as vital information that needs to be transmitted to as many people as far and wide as possible.
Yeah, totally. And then I think the other thing that really happened both in blogging and podcasting for me is like, I get asked the same question a lot because I have a global coaching community. So a student 3 years ago will ask a question that after this one I'm coaching later today with the Yogi Detox, someone will ask that same question. And I can just be like, okay, there's Google YogaHealer community building and look for Peter Block and listen to that one, and to me, that reference library is so useful.
Yeah, it's so funny because I have a past client. She's an executive coach for CEOs, and she did 3 seasons of her show, and it's just kind of, she didn't do anything past that. But now she considers her podcast episodes what she calls prescriptions, which in your case actually are more prescriptive in terms of a healing nature than her intention. But she'll have calls with either prospects or people that she's working with and say, you know what, go back and listen to episodes, 2 and 4, where we expound on the importance of like honesty in the workplace, and then schedule a follow-up call with me if you think it's valuable and we could have you think we should be working together. So to your point, this idea of evergreen content that is valuable, whether you're listening to it now or years from now, I think is a really, really important key takeaway for podcasters to really think about the content you're creating continues to live on.
Yeah. I mean, I'm curious about that, even your advice to me for that. Like, my sense is right now is I should really just do a season based on my new book, based on Wild Habits. That's both solo casting and the scientist interviews. And just have it as a season. And rather than try to produce weekly, like actually just produce that library. So then I have the library. What do you think?
Yeah, I like that idea a lot because what you can do is be very specific. One of the exercises we do with new clients is we have them plan out their first 12 episodes. And all I want them to do is write either the guest they're going to have on or the title of the episode. I want them to title it before they've even produced it. Because what that does is it has you reverse engineer. Like if my episode was titled, The Benefits of Intermittent Fasting, Why Intermittent Fasting for 7 days a Week Can Dramatically Change Your resistance to diseases, or just that's a first pass. But when people see a title like that, and what I've been seeing in terms of like the algorithm is the title of the episode is still one of those SEO visible fields. So it's important. And I actually like it when titles are long and they sort of run on and get cut off in Apple Podcasts. But, be descriptive, how I overcame Crohn's disease and turned that lesson into something that ended up saving my mother's life. Like you're being pulled in more and more by that title of that. You're like almost to the point where like you're compelled, if it's something that resonates with you or it's relevant to where you are in your life, you're like, the feeling should evoke something like, I need to hear this episode right now.
Yeah.
And that's the feeling you want to evoke.
I love it. Can I ask another question?
Absolutely. I'm
like taking over your interview.
These are the best kind because it's a conversation.
Right? So
yeah.
So with this book, this is my 4th book. And 2 of them I used a publisher. Well, actually, I independently published, and then a publisher picked it up. And this one, no one will touch it because I also have urine therapy as one of the habits in there, which is very controversial, even in the most liberal of healing spaces. Fascinatingly enough, even though it's an ancient habit, it's found in all cultures, etc. So, in any case, I'm independently publishing this one, and I also wanted to because I wanted to own my own content again and just see the difference between the royalties versus self-publishing and see if I can sell foreign rights and all that. So in any case, I'm like, well, each of these chapters, it's so packed, it's so dense. And my members love it when I read from the book, because I've been reading it to them as I've been writing it so they could ask questions so I could improve the book as we go.
Oh, great. That's nice. Smart.
And so now I'm like, maybe each of these chapters, like I publish as an episode, and then that drives books and membership and courses that are based on how do you actually do these habits, because habits are much easier to do in community. What do you think of that?
I like that. I think one of the things one of my coaches told me that resonated with me is people get so worried in this in this space who have content to deliver. They're like, oh, I'm giving away my best stuff. And the way he described it once is that you provide the what and the why for free, and what people will pay for is the how.
Yeah.
And I thought that was really important. And I think, you may think that you're giving away content that's going to be found in the book, but it's also this aspect of, there's some good stuff with digital marketing that's really valuable about these various touch points, and people, whatever the number is now, 7, 10, 14 times, people need to interact with you, whether it's seeing your stuff on your newsletter, whether it's hearing you on the podcast, whether it's seeing you on social media, but they have to have like X number of touch points before it starts to click in, like, oh, I keep hearing about Cate, and I keep hearing about Cate, keep hearing about Cate, she keeps talking about this, she keeps talking about this, maybe I should listen. And I think the podcast, because of the nature of how it's delivered, because of the nature of how it's consumed, you don't have to sit down as you do, you can't, it's hard to read a book on a bicycle.
Yeah.
It's hard to watch a YouTube video while you're making dinner, but like the beauty of podcasting, it's like you have that immersive media that you can sort of consume while you're doing other stuff. And I think it makes it more accessible. I always tell people, like, don't forget that Apple Podcasts in and of itself is a search engine. So people are looking for something. They'll probably go into Apple and say, intermittent fasting, and they'll see what episodes pop up. So I think being in a place where people are looking for data and looking for information and looking for help actually is really important. And I think even if you are, whether it's the book, you're publishing it and the book is out already, or you're still using it as a test bed to see if the content is resonating, and use the feedback that you get from the episode to tweak that specific chapter. I love it. I think it's a really specific, and you can almost build it as a sort of peek behind the curtain of your journey to writing this book. Mm-hmm. People love origin stories. There was a really popular podcast called Startup about the company called Gimlet, which was, Alex Bloomberg. He came from radio, and then he literally was recording, because he comes from radio, like speaking to his wife about the name of the company, and speaking to, like, having an interview that he recorded with Chris Sacca from Twitter, and how awkward he was trying to explain what a podcast network was. But as an entrepreneur, I was like, it was riveting, like, podcast content, because you felt like you were like hearing him like work through the process in his mind of like what it's like to start something and describe it to somebody and get investment and create a company. And, anyone who's gone down that journey can relate to that. And I think this idea of, how the sausage is made, from a book perspective could be fascinating and educational and inspirational at the same time.
Yeah, totally. Actually, we did just release a podcast in the past month on how to write a book with a community. And I kind of go through the process with that, because I actually wrote the book in Vellum, which is a Kindle publishing app. It's not a writing app.
Okay.
But it was so good for like screen sharing in real time, where they could read it in the format instead of, because like when you read a book on Kindle, it's way better than reading a 60,000 word PDF. Which doesn't even load, right? It like can crash on Google before it loads.
No,
and there's no index.
I've loaded PDFs and yeah, it's horrible.
Yeah, I love it. So yeah, how the sausage is made. Absolutely. That's great. That's a great reinforcement. Yeah. I mean, I was even like, I'm so not attached to owning stuff, like just publishing every chapter as a blog post, which is a pain if you want to read a book, but it's like they're all an access point in. They all have SEO for that searchability for people to find an answer.
Yeah, and I think anyone who's serious about learning about the topic, especially something like that, it's almost like there's certain books that lend themselves well, as much as I love Kindles myself, like to having almost as a reference manual in your hand.
Yeah, totally.
And there's nothing beats like saying like, what's that chapter where she talked specifically about a protocol, for meditation, for fasting, what have you. And then that'll probably be a page that's dog-eared and highlighted. And it's, there's something to having that handy I am the tech part, the tech nerd in me loves the Kindle, the highlights. I use an app called Read It Later. So anything that gets highlighted in Kindle shows up in Read It later. And then that reinforces me on my app because I kind of go through my Read It Later stuff once a day. So there's different ways depending on how you process information. But yeah. I'm all for, in this day and age, just like getting, I think this all comes full circle to like your mission of like, where what impact you want to leave on this world. And, just everything that you've pulled together, the access to the conversations you have, all lend itself well to just getting this out there. And, just if it's, you'll be compensated accordingly.
Yeah.
I just know it, there's not, it all balances out in the end.
Yeah. Yeah. Amen.
So I really appreciate where this conversation went. I'm going to subscribe to the podcast and start to get caught up on some of these episodes. But I think, just that guidance of like being more specific if you're not already with like the content of the episodes in the title, because then people can start to reference almost like looking at the catalog, because especially you with so much content, I think there's some curation required for people to be like, okay, by scanning the titles, they can start to see, does this fit into what I need? And then maybe even next level would be to say, like maybe someone on your team could start to put together these 8 episodes deal with like intermittent fasting. These 8 episodes cover inflammation. These 8 episodes deal with like, some of these conversations you're having with these, thought leaders in the space, these scientists that are not getting the visibility they should. But yeah, it feels like there's no shortage.
And doing that via web pages, or how would you organize that?
Yeah. Yeah, I think you could do in web pages, and I think you could do, even at the very least, just kind of like plugging in whoever you're hosting with. They'll give you an embed player, but you're just embedding the episodes there. So you have a page just on like one specific topic. And again, it's challenging when people come to existing podcasts that have such a deep catalog, they don't know where to start.
Yeah.
So what I've seen being used successfully is people saying, are you new to the podcast? You might kind of get started with our 10 most popular episodes and just kind of list them out and provide like a playlist for folks.
Oh, nice. That's super helpful. We're in the middle of doing that, like this whole pillar of content on the website that's topic specific. But I love that if you're starting here, that's great.
Yeah. You mentioned you were thinking of changing the name of the show?
Well, I mean, it's like deeper than that. So my 2 brands are YogaHealer and Yoga Health Coaching. So YogaHealer since 2001 and Yoga Health Coaching since 2012. So what's happened over time is yoga has changed. Like what people think of yoga has really changed. And so now yoga is associated with online streaming yoga classes, and we don't do that. Lead people out of chronic inflammation through the habits of circadian rhythm, which yes are based in yoga philosophy, but we're going way more mainstream. So I have to rebrand everything. And on the yoga health coaching side, we get not nurses and doctors and Chinese medicine practitioners and energy workers and nutritionists and personal trainers. And I mean, they do great in our coaching program. It's also a business in a box program, and they get a really strong business model where they don't have to become internet marketers in order to have the career that they want to have. But everything is like, the brand is a barrier, and it's such a bummer, in a way, to have built a brand for 20 years and be like, oh my gosh, and it's been working against me for about 7 of the past years. And now I'm finally like, this year is the year. So we're rebranding to a coaching company. We don't have a name, and I'm not sure what'll happen with the backlog or how we'll change the name, or if we need to change the name, or if I just need to add another show. So I'd love your advice on that too, Harry.
Yeah. Let's have a follow-up. I mean, my marketing brain kicks in for these sort of conversations, and I love geeking out on this sort of stuff. And this is some of my best sessions with clients, and even when we're just thinking about names, because I'm just like, okay, let's get as creative as possible. Because what I tell clients is when people look at the name, it should evoke a feeling of like, this is a show I probably should be listening to. Mm-hmm. Like I started a second show called the Vertical Farming Podcast, and there's like no mystery as to what the show is about. And if you Google those 3 words.
Oh, I'm going to start listening. I have an incredible greenhouse where I was just telling my husband, I'm like, I need to work on my vertical.
Yeah. What's interesting, what I did there, Cate, is I was trying to see if we could just create our own production client, and I said, well, we know we've got the agency Fullcast, which produces shows for business clients. I'm comfortable interviewing because I've been doing it since 2014, long form interviews. So I put those two sort of superpowers together. And then I strategically said, I want to focus on interviews with CEOs and founders of these companies. So now it's 4 seasons in. I've had a sponsor from day one because they see the value of like speaking to a niche audience. I just spoke about this in Podcast Movement LA last week. And, the podcast has generated over close to 60K in revenue from sponsorships.
Wow. Specifically
because and then it's easier and easier and easier for me to get CEOs of these companies now to come on the show because they just look at the back catalog and they see all their colleagues there. They're like, oh, you've spoken to him, you've spoken to her, wow, I have to be on your show. And then the sponsor was like, they just renewed for seasons 5 and 6 because they said, in their own words, we're not letting this go. Like they said, we've got clients coming to us that say, we heard you on the podcast. And so, it's kind of all this to say just the value of just being very specific about what the podcast is. It's specifically about vertical farming, not agriculture or ag tech. It's specifically about that niche. And I think that's been given me a lot of focus. I've since started Vertical Farming Jobs, Vertical Farming Weekly. So just kind of thinking of all the different ways they can sort of cross-reference each other as well. So all that to say, when we have our follow-up conversation, just kind of do that brainstorm, just thinking about like when people see the name of the show, like what's the sort of like the vision of where do you want to take them on that journey?
I love it. Yeah.
So as we wrap up, I have a couple of questions I usually ask towards the end. The first is, what's something you've changed your mind about recently?
What is something I've changed my mind about recently? Oh my gosh. Well, I could talk about, recently as in the last year. How's that?
Yeah.
So I'm 49 years old, and the most massive change in my life has been around urine therapy, which is totally bizarre, but it is literally found in every indigenous culture. And that your urine is your medicine. You can use it in any orifice, your eyes, your ears, your mouth, your nose, your anus. It restores the microbiomes of the body. So it helps the microbiomes release nitric oxide, which is a massive anti-inflammatory, anti-pathogen. So I've really changed my mind about what urine actually is. So now I consider urine as 3 things: hydration, nutrition, and medicine.
Is that available in a recent podcast episode?
There's like 10 of them. Yeah. There's a lot in YouTube and on YogaHealer. There's a lot on urine therapy. Some would say there's been a little too much, but again, that's part of my exploration with who are leaders in the field of urine therapy. Urine therapy goes way back. So like the Buddha talked about it. It's in the 3 main ancient Ayurvedic texts from about 2,000 years ago. It's one of those things. It's like once you're in the know and you get it, you see the entire world differently. Like you see, like talk about, human as creator. You see everything differently. It's quite profound. And then you see how much we are in a consumer culture and how much we're being sold hydration, nutrition, and medicine. So yeah, radical. It's radical. And part of the reason I had to write Wild Habits was because I have to release these other books after that really focus on urine therapy, but I needed people to understand the context, like, people that are into intermittent fasting and people that are into hydration and are into positive stressors and doing the hard thing and that are into cryotherapy and all silence and meditation and all the things I talk about in Wild Habits. Is I kind of wanted to give that context. I wanted it to give it the scientific context as well in terms of how the physiology works with inflammation and reversing inflammation. So now that it was a bitch of a book, but now that groundwork is laid, I can go more into this is exactly how we call it UT, how urine therapy works.
That it is also lend itself to a page that would just be pulling those 10 episodes, right? And if people just want to, here's the primer on urine therapy, and go listen to these 10 episodes. And so that's just a perfect example of how curating the content would be. Yeah,
and actually the team is tasked with that right now. So this is this is such an affirmation that we're doing exactly the right work in marketing. And can I drop a link in because I have a free P-book.
Yeah.
It's yogahealer.com.
I love it.
Yeah. So for anyone who's like, what the hell is she talking about? yogahealer.com/P-book. And it's a little guide, and it's just like just to get people up to speed on what this is. Because I think everyone should know what it is and why people are using it.
I appreciate you sharing that. We'll make sure to include that in the show notes as well. What's the most misunderstood thing about you?
Oh, people think I'm intimidating. So for those of you who are into personality profiles, on the Gallup strengths test. My number 2 strength is command. And it's extremely unusual in today's day and age to have a woman who's high in command. So just by the nature of like how I show up, like I have a lot of influencer in my personality. So I like literally can get people to like jump off a cliff or start urine therapy or whatever. But it's that command that makes people think I'm intimidating. And I'm like, I really don't mean to be intimidating at all. I'm just sharing information in an emphatic way.
Well, I think what comes through for me is a passion for the subject matter and an understanding that, not to put words in your mouth, but it feels like this is something that is your calling. And the fact that you've been doing it for so long means you've had like a front row seat at the transformational power of going down this path and how it can, improve your life for the better, and that there's no wrong or too old age to start this. And I think everything that you've done from just this conversation, what I've observed and just intuit is that, this is just part of a lifelong mission for you. It's taken many forms, started, as the blog, and it's changed into the podcast, and now it's going to become the book, the courses. And it feels like the more people whose lives you transform, those will almost also be kind of the evangelist for you as well, to get to spread the message far and wide. So I think it's amazing work that you're doing. I love serendipitous interactions that weren't planned. And so obviously someone from your team reached out to connect us. Oh, Esther just has been sending me some awesome folks to have conversations with. So shout out to Esther. And I just am appreciative of those moments when I get to have really fascinating conversations that I wasn't expecting, and on topics that are really important for this planet.
Thanks, Harry. Well, I'm going to go to my college reunion, my 25th at Carleton this summer, so maybe I'll look you up when I'm in the Twin Cities.
Yeah, please do. We'd love to grab lunch or hot water.
Yeah, exactly. Go for a walk. We'll go for a walk around the lake. We'll go rollerblading. Even better. What to do in the Twin Cities.
We'll hang up. Yeah. We'll not eat and drink hot water. It'll be awesome. Well, I appreciate your time. We'll make sure all those links in the show notes. Any other place you want to direct folks to connect with you?
I do have live events, so yogahealer.com/events. If you want to meet up with me in Wyoming or Lisbon, those are our next 2, and those are highly transformational. They're very much life-changing workshops that we do in person.
How long are they?
3 days. We use liberating structures. Okay. It's not about learning, it's about doing, but you align your life and your goals with a solid strategy that you never would have come up with had you not come.
Well, my partner and I are making a concerted effort to include not only like the conference stuff in our planning, but also just wellness getaways, retreats. So I'm definitely going to jump on that site when we're done here just to learn a little bit more and see if the timing works out, because I'd love to. And it seems like a nice span of time for some change. So it's definitely something we want to be more conscious of. Thanks again to Cate for coming on the show.
Awesome,
Always
Harry.
Appreciative of the hour my guests spend with me. I say it time and time again, and it's something
my
that you
pleasure.
should be thankful for if you are a host with guests on your show. I have this mantra, you've heard it before, treat your guests like gold, and I'm never not appreciative when folks decide to spend their hour with me. Full show notes available at podcastjunkies.com/297. Summary, timestamps, key takeaways, quotes from the episode, resources mentioned, all that good stuff. And we take great pains to make sure it's all there for you in case you found something valuable in the show that you need to circle back and reference. Intro and outro music composed by Cedar and Soil, cedarsoil.com for his full catalog of fantastic music. Don't forget to check out our sponsor, Focusrite, their awesome line of new gear, specifically the Vocaster line. And you can learn more at podcastjunkies.com/Vocaster. Podcast production and marketing provided by Fullcast. Learn more at fullcast.co. Tune in next week for my conversation with Mike McCowan. And if you made it this far, you no doubt looking for this week's retention hashtag. Let's go with YogaKate, hashtag YogaKate. And you can tag her at Cate Stillman, CateStillman, and us at podcast_junkies. Thanks for everything you do to support the show. I truly appreciate it from the bottom of my heart. Talk to you next week.